Thank you, John. So, what our challenge now is to see, learning from that. We don't want to waste this opportunity, these lessons that we've learned. How can we take that and apply those lessons elsewhere using the capabilities that the UK's got? As John was just saying, every place is different. So we can't just take all of this and say, right, we'll go and apply it in Rio or the candidate cities for the Olympics after that. Or for every Olympics, there must be a few, I don't know, can't quantify it, 100 other regeneration projects that haven't had the benefit of the catalyst of the Olympics, that just need regenerating, need new infrastructure. So can I throw it open now for people who want to ask questions of the panelists or make comments of their own? If you're not careful, I'll ask you individually.
Thank you very much. Hello, Jeremy Beaton. Welcome, Had. Yeah, just a question about the elephant and castle. So if I was the Minister for Communities and Local Government, I've just magically become Eric Pickles. What would you say about changing the planning infrastructure that we have in this country? Is it a help or a hindrance? What messages should we as a group give to government about how do we make stuff like that happen better, faster, more accurately, on time, on budget, etc., etc.?
Yes, please.
Yeah, shall I have a go?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, in terms of the elephant, I think the localism issues, the idea of talking to people, has been not superficial. It's out there, but we did it anyway. We were always of a mind, and the developer was of a mind, that communication between us and them, as it's perceived, should be a sort of broken down those barriers, and it's always us. And what's worked there, be it due to government pushing or not, is the fact that the project is owned by the people that live there now, not just those that will come in, but those that live there now. Because it's always easy to design for those that are coming, because you don't know who they are. So informing those that are currently there, even though they're not necessarily going to buy into what you're building, is important. So whether government is dealing with that or not, I'm not altogether sure.
Yep.
I was fascinated by the elephant and castle. I'm the director of one of the development companies who 7 years ago was bidding into yet another round of bidding. John's point, it's taken 15 years so far. We're talking about 2024. I mean, they are unbelievable timescales. And if you look at the scale of the elephant and castle, it matches pretty well the scale of the Olympic Village. And the layout in some respects, the central areas, the green areas and so on, quite similar in concept. And that's been done in basically 5 years. And fundamentally because of planning. And because of that ability to actually just get on with it. Now, against that is clearly the lack of any widespread communication. But you have to ask the question, do we just talk ourselves to death in this country? We over-consult, we over-communicate to the point where we finish up not doing anything. I mean, I actually can remember in the late 60s, early 70s, when I worked for Laing, we had those blocks on the front of our magazine, proudly, we've built the longest block in Europe. But anyway, and you might argue that all that happened rather too quickly in the 60s, the industrialized building concept and the speed with which that went ahead, without taking on board perhaps the social impact of what we were creating. But there has to be somewhere between 5 years and 30 years, because otherwise, whole generations are being denied the opportunity to live in areas which they're proud to live in.
So maybe our planning regime is not one with high export potential then, in terms of how we. And I just wondered if there are people here who could, because where is that balance? Those of us who have worked in parts of Asia, in China or in Hong Kong, then actually value the efficiency with which the infrastructure is both conceived, designed, and then gets into execution. Actually, maybe people would be surprised, actually public utilities in the United States is very slow. The whole process of getting approvals for that, you know, in the country of fast track, it always surprises me in the United States how long things do take, the sort of things that we're looking at. You were talking about India. India has got a planning regime which actually is very, very slow. I know it varies by states, and there are some more dynamic than others. But where's the balance in that? I just wondered if people here have got some comments on that, and where that should be.
Terry, just a quick comment. I'm afraid the grim reality of this, in my view, is that benign dictatorships occasionally get things done. And listening to the conversation earlier today about airports, you know, it's very interesting that there is a great opportunity to build an airport in the Thames. I was talking to someone a little while ago, and they said that will take 25 years. In Hong Kong, with British contractors, British engineers, it was done in under 10 years under a British administration. But there was a level of this is what's going to happen in the interests of all, and we've listened enough, and that's the end of it. And I do think that the time has come when we have to have a little bit less democracy and a little more drive for the common good in the longer haul for the generations who will follow us. Otherwise, we will have seriously let them down.
Can I just add to that? I don't think you want less democracy, you want more democracy, but you want better decision-making and quicker decision-making.
Going ahead.
In the Elephant and Gate, did you have any issues to relocate people? Were they have any been relocated? Have they been incentivized to relocate?
Well, as I said earlier, on this morning, the only people living on the park were, how many, Georgia, in the 3 traveller communities? Yeah, so there were 100 people in 3 traveller communities, and so we built new parks, basically, within about a mile of where they're currently living. That required, you know, delicate handling and quite a lot of discussion with them. But in a sense, it was, I'm sorry, we are going to move you. You know, and now let's sit down and agree what's the best way to move you, how best can we create something that you will want to live in and create a community for you a mile away from the one where you're living presently.
Yeah, can I just say at the Elephant we had a similar decanting process where obviously at the Haygate it was slowly declining, but we had over 800 people living there, which gradually were decanted into what we call the early housing scheme. So we set up a framework of some 15 architects who then designed on 20 sites new homes for these people to move into. And we did ask them beforehand, and there was a 83% agreement to doing that. So it was, you know, a democratic process, if you will, but they knew that this was going to happen. Now, there are other underlying tones about the politics of how perhaps the estate became run down in the first place. You know, lack of funding, perhaps it was a place that certain people were decanted in that they shouldn't have been in the first place, which set it on a certain trajectory. But after that, okay, there was a democratic process. People have now moved away. But those who have moved away have still got the right, if they had chosen to do so at the time, to come back. So when it's done, if they want to come back, they're welcome.
Could I just add a point, if I may, just a quick one? Whilst there was a small number of people who were relocated off the park, there were many thousands of people who lived in close proximity to the park. And one of our big challenges was how to get on with our neighbours, because with the wrong actions, they could have stopped us dead in our tracks at any time. And George, I remember a very difficult meeting on one occasion where someone in the audience, a local community representative, summed it up very clearly. They said, we'll put up with inconvenience, we know we're going to have some. We'll put up with it as long as you respect us and you leave us something for our future. And that, I think, was one of the real keys to bringing a lot of people along.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Ali. I work with the Africa Finance Corporation. We basically finance infrastructure projects across sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things I haven't really heard a lot of discussion on is costs. If you look at many industries, computers obviously and telecoms is a big one, where costs have fallen dramatically over the last quarter of a century. Now, obviously, we work in poor countries where costs of infrastructure are very critical in order to be able to supply, underserved people. So I'm just wondering what the innovation and technology and creativity we've been hearing about today can offer in terms of, reducing the cost of some of these projects. Thank you.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant question, because I must admit, it surprises me that in virtually every other sector that you can think of, whether it's automobiles, mobile phones, telecom, whatever, prices and costs are coming down. And they're coming down faster than I think they are in construction. So I think it's a really good question. Uwe,
it's an excellent question. Unfortunately, we don't have Moore's law in construction, so that doesn't work that well. And that's clearly one of the fundamental reasons why this is not the case. It's not the production industry, it's very local, what we are doing at the end of the day when you put the shovel in the ground. But what has improved significantly and has improved on the cost significantly is the way we use technology to do the interface management in large construction projects. And clearly, the talk of the day is BIM, so kind of a building integrated management system where you not only use 3D design to find design clutches in your design, but also where you put it on a time scale and basically simulate what can you do in order to do a certain amount of construction faster, smarter, just by the sequence in which you face the different construction phases and how to deal with complex site logistics. And that has changed, is going to change the industry even more in the future, but has already changed the industry significantly. And that's where how all of us are investing heavily in training of our people, in the training of the supply chain, to introduce this new technology and to make building faster and less costly by addressing the interfaces in this process.
I was going to ask Howard if he could make a comment on that, because you might think this is a bit of a glib comment. Before the recession, when most of the economies of the world were booming, I used to go around advising either governments or politicians or investors the way to get projects delivered on time, on budget, is to have plenty of time and a big budget. The thing is, we can't do that now. Times are different. We've actually got to be able to deliver the more for less. How did you achieve that with the
I think that one of the issues, I'm just conscious of the location in which you're probably undertaking these projects. Just let's talk about efficiency of people for a minute. And people are people everywhere. One of the issues that I think we've all been amazed about is the efficiency of an engaged workforce. I mentioned too the importance of health and safety and the welfare of the workforce, and it sounds a bit like motherhood apple pie, and I said it was good business, and it is. Very interestingly, nearly 6 years ago now, when we worked out broadly how many people it would need to build the Olympic Park at peak, we thought it would be in the order of 15, possibly up to 18,000 people. We never peaked above 12,500 people. We had almost no rework, almost no waste, and a workforce that produced a quality job in record time. And how does that transfer into good economics? Well, if you take our logistics program alone, some £320 million, we saved about 25% of that because we didn't have to accommodate as many people. So £80 million went back into the pot as a result of having a smaller workforce. So that's the sort of innovation which I think we tend to talk about technical innovation, but I actually think the workforce, how it operates, how it works, how it's engaged in its tasks each day is very important. And actually labour is still one of the biggest components in the construction process.
But I was thinking in your current role, Howard, then Laing are very much at the leading edge of how to actually get more efficiency into construction. And I was thinking, what are the observations on that?
I'll pick that one up as well. So the first thing I've covered is that you want to have the minimum labour force on any project, because that's the most efficient way to work. Laing is very focused now on massive investment. We probably are one of the largest investors in sort of development. We have a huge facility, £120 million facility in the north of England, which actually produces buildings there, prefabricated buildings, generally in concrete, and we're reducing the times on site by up to 70%. We can deliver a school in one academic year. It normally takes 2. So there are a lot of innovations, and of course these are again quite exportable. We use the same techniques in the Middle East. And interestingly, just as an aside, we're currently producing 1.5 million railway sleepers in Dubai in one of our facilities and shipping them to Australia, because that's the most economic way to do it.
Yeah,
John?
I think that these solutions, though, don't necessarily address somewhere like Africa. And I can recall again going back to when we were needing, for example, to put up a lot of housing in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, it was Laing created a system called EasyForm. Now, the EasyForm system, the principle was there were no cranes. And it was actually fairly labor intensive. But the formwork was all man-handleable. The concrete could be placed with a hoist and some barrows, and the floors were timber. And I think for many of us, the challenge going forward, particularly in places like Africa, is how do we not spend £200 a square foot, but how do we actually spend £20 a square foot to actually create buildings? Because that is the sort of challenge which I think we have to take on. And there are lessons to be learnt from the past. Today, I was at some award ceremonies for sustainable construction recently, and there they create a new product where essentially what were polystyrene walls. So they turned polystyrene into a structural product which could actually be man-handled into place. Therefore making it very easy, relatively low skill, because again the important thing I think in countries like Africa is that you employ the local labour, you engage the local labour, you raise the skill base of the local labour, and that requires thinking about what are all the techniques that we've used in the past, because very often some of the things when we had a surplus of labour is what we need to be looking at in countries where labour is cheap, and we shouldn't be seeking to use modern almost factory techniques in an environment where in fact labour is cheap, it's relatively remote, and therefore you've got to try and use local materials.
But I also think that there is perhaps a new paradigm coming across in lower income countries. There's a leap in other technologies. There's a leapfrog already happened. You know, there is far more uptake of mobile telecommunications and so on across developing countries than the growth rate than has been elsewhere. And cities, that's where the cities are growing the most. And I think that our attitude to construction, all of us, needs to change radically and bring the efficiencies that we can see in other industries into construction as well. Stephen, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, Steve Prendergast. I think the area that you touched on is time and cost related to those interrelationships between the two. You know, if you can generally accelerate programs, you bring down the cost. And yet, most of the projects, large projects we start off, which are going to take 25 years, there's an acceptance that it's going to take 25 years. And actually, why can't it take 5 years? Why can't it take 2 years? There's electrification programs on the rail network. We're going to take 6 years to do that. Well, where did you get the 6 years from? Well, we made it up because that's what we think it's going to take. Now, what's been achieved in the Olympics has been, there's a time frame, and we did it in the time frame. And why can't we do everything like that? I mean, as you know, Howard, you know, if you take Chepler-Cock, you know, speed, time, reduce cost. And that, I think, is about changing the benchmarks in government and what their expectation is for infrastructure projects. I mean, HS2, well, we're going to take 18, 20 years to build this. Why? You know, is it necessary to take that long? Could you do it quicker? And could you get the cost down? And that's the area, you know, we're into a world where we've got economic meltdown, you know, and a lot of other countries want to learn from this. What we've achieved at the Olympics is being able to do this in a very short time and reduce that cost. Maybe
we need clients to make unreasonable demands on the industry. We did a casino in Macau, and our office in Hong Kong is probably one of the fastest there is at getting stuff out. That casino was built quicker than we designed it. I mean, I was just amazed. And we went from, it was on reclaimed land, it was from open water to the roll of the first dice. I think it was about 18 months to do all of that. Having said that, it paid for itself even quicker than that. But the point was that actually there was a client who just said, this has to be there, that time, we'll do whatever's necessary to do it and do it. So perhaps it is, you're right, perhaps we've all got it in our head that a metro takes 5 years to get done. 3 years construction, 1 year system, 1 year to get it to commission it. Why can't we challenge some of those
Terry, can I just make a final point on that? I think, first of all, the government needs to be more ambitious in setting these things. I think the other issue is we shouldn't remember that incentivization is very important. One of the reasons I think we were successful on the Olympic program is because everybody was incentivized. If people saved, then they got part of the saving, and we did as a client. And I think so we had completely aligned objectives, very ambitious program, but we were sharing in the success all the way through. So I think if you use that incentivization, you can start to drag things down.
There's a question over here, one over there. John?
John Nutt, UKTI International Business Specialist. Slightly different tack, really, and just touching on John Armitt's reference to Africa and Uwe Krueger's, one of his opening slides about population growth. Of course, I think of the population growth we're due to see going forwards, 1 billion will be in sub-Saharan Africa, which is quite amazing when you think about it, and the other billion will be in Asia. Coming to urban density, and John Prevc was touching on urban density, which is increasing in these countries with high population growth. One of the key challenges seems to be, in terms of urban environment really, is issues of air quality. I know we talk about getting in lots of sustainable transport systems, that's fine, but unfortunately in the real world, much of it still revolves around the use of the car and vehicles. And air quality is a huge issue, it seems to me, in some of these major urban conurbations. I mean, I happened to be in India the other day, and I think it was a BBC World article about Hong Kong, the gentleman sitting over me. I know they've got huge challenges, I think, on air quality in Hong Kong. He might have something to say that. But what's John or the panel's view about urban density? We're increasing it everywhere around the world, and it's a real challenge.
In my view, I think density is an inevitability. It has to happen until public transport improves such that it becomes less of a necessity. As the connections get better, I mean, I commute, dare I say, from Coventry every day. Obviously not the centre of everyone's planet, but it is mine. And it was until that time that Virgin Trains picked up the Pendolino that it got actually worthwhile doing. It's still expensive, but it's more sustainable than driving. I would never drive. And in a sense, these larger cities are expanding exponentially, but their core is always growing. It's always getting denser. The quality of the air, and I've got a project in Mumbai at the moment, and walking around Mumbai is a struggle. It's a hell of a place. Absolutely, you want to be there. It's very vibrant. But the air quality is appalling. And that's because it's emerging, it's changing, it's moving from something that people are walking on foot and cycle to having a car. The middle classes are expanding. And you cannot deny these places their right to purchase things that are status symbols or making life easier. However, technology has to follow. So we're looking forward to battery-powered cars, we're looking forward to more sustainable public transport systems in Mumbai, for example. It's trying its best to do it. But it's making the capital available. And someone said to me, why can China put all these things in place, and in India you cannot? And an Indian said, well, we're a democracy. Now, that's an easy answer, I suppose, for them to say, but if you put money into it, you'll get something out of it. So it is investing in the right bits of infrastructure at the right time in order to, facilitate that change.
But I think, John, this is said lots of times about this country. I know, that democracy is the reason why we have all this bureaucracy and process and things like that. We can criticise if we like, but actually, in a way, I think it's down to us to actually craft the democratically acceptable solutions so that actually people want it. I think we'll learn that from the Olympics. We certainly learnt that from HS1, where there was actually for the scale of project, very little opposition to it. In fact, I can remember a time when communities were saying, come and put it through our borough. You know, they wanted that. I think HS2 is a different part of the country, that'd be more difficult. But I think democracy is something that we should actually work with to find the right...
Yeah, democracy is important, but what I think is crippling it is the fact that we're not making it a shorter programme, and we're actually always trying to talk to too many people on too many levels. Whereas if you can somehow manage it in such a way that you can cut across all that, and actually, as John said, for the national good, and make that the point, then you just have to make the decision. And I agree with what was said earlier, mayors in cities are critical. And it's a shame that my hometown voted against it, Birmingham voted against it, and I have no idea why that happened. Well, perhaps I do, but...
But there are encouraging signs out there that people who fell in love with the car start to embrace public transport if it is done right. So Dubai Metro is an example for that. Clearly, the Emirates, I can tell you, is a country that fell in love with the car, and yet the passenger traffic on the new Dubai monorail has exceeded all expectations. We see another case in point would be Kuala Lumpur, also an example for a fast-growing metropolis with poor air quality, and now there are massive plans on the way with regard to mass rapid transport to change that with a $90 billion investment into the Klang Valley projects. So I guess both from a political point of view, but also just from the pressure people feel living in the city, everybody starts to understand there needs to be a behavioral change as well to that, but that needs to be matched by attractive developments. And that's not only an efficient, mass rapid transport system, it's also in being creative from an architecture and design perspective to generate transport-oriented development, so revenue-generating real estate around it where people just enjoy walking back and forth between different transport hubs, and that it becomes part of a lifestyle experience. I guess that's also part of the success I feel when international colleagues of mine experience traveling back and forth to the Olympic Park, the easy access to everything, the fact that you walk through a very pleasant shopping opportunity there, that all adds to people embracing it, and that's what we see in developing cities now as well.
I think there was a question here.
Good morning, I'm Bernard Hornung from Spiralite. And this is really a question for Sir John and Howard Shiplee. I'm not an engineer or an architect, I'm the simple soul possibly in this room. My formative years were as a frontline soldier. And so I work alongside engineers and people who manufacture the product which I sell. And I'm very proud to be British, to be in manufacturing, and to be a specialist supplier into the construction industry. And what I've seen is that there is a change towards production rather than construction. And I'm certainly heartened by the general direction in which Laing are going. I'm absolutely convinced that this is indeed the right way to go. And if we can spend more time in planning and more time in production and less time on site and less time on construction, we will certainly address the majority of the challenges that we all face. And so my question to you is, how can we accelerate this process, going from construction to production in order to be able to deliver?
Try that.
Oh, well, John.
Yeah, well, the first point I would make is the point that Howard made earlier on about client leadership. And to benefit in the way that you can from those sort of system and the building information management approach to a project, you've got to, at the front end, be saying that's how we're going to do it. You can't bolt it on. And that requires the architect, in fact, to be part of that process with the client at the very beginning, which says that we want this to be a, if you like, a very productive construction process, not a traditional construction process, And that's a real challenge, because clients and architects are so often wanting to do something which is bespoke, which is unique, and which is special. And I think the real challenge we face is how do you match those two things of creating something which is different, which provides another level of artistic pleasure and within the building, whilst at the same time finding something which is actually, if you like, the car industry in terms of efficiency of production. And therefore it requires the leadership of the client, which says, in a sense, as Terry said, being very demanding and saying, I want both. You know, I want both the penny and the bun. I want something which is really good architecturally and has a quality to it. But at the same time, will you work with the Laing O'Rourke's or whoever to actually do this in a way which is highly productive?
I think the challenge we're really debating here, first of all, industries do not create marketplaces. Some do, but essentially it is the customer who creates the marketplace and industries respond. Now, I think the issue, particularly if you take government, I think there is an opportunity where many of the things we're talking about should be driven much harder by government. After all, they're now the biggest customer of construction and engineering at the moment, in my view. And therefore, I think they should be taking a much more robust position in terms of A, being more demanding, and B, being more knowledgeable. And I think it's just taking them far too long to get switched on to the sort of issues that you're addressing, and to better understand the industries that they're dealing with. And just a final point, a colleague in a department in government was some time ago criticised for solving problems in his supply chain. And he was criticised, and when on investigation, quite a lot of people in the public sector, I have to say, think that engaging with the supply chain actually invalidates their position of independence, which I think is a very, very bad position to be in. They need to get their hands dirty and get in amongst industry. That's the way to be successful, in my view.
Just one other point I can make. As an architect, I'm frustrated that the constructors are not in earlier. And what we need is the construction business, the actual builder, to be in on the design team at an earlier stage in order to work together to get to the right answer. There are lots of benefits in that. Why it's not, I have no clue. Well,
because the client doesn't do it.
Cost, yeah. It's about tendering, it's about all that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
But tell me, I don't know, Uwe, maybe you can help me with this. I totally understand the shift to production, the replication, the mass production that can go in a buildings market. I don't see, does that work with heavy civils, with infrastructure, with the tunnels, the metros, the energy, the water supply, and so on? Does replication work to get that efficiency in other areas?
Well, could I try that one? I mean, if I may, just very quickly, we used to have a tunnelling industry. We don't have one anymore. And one of the reasons is because each tunnel is always different. So, and who is driving these tunnels, all of this work, is government again. So why don't we have a joined-up solution that's a tunnelling solution, and we don't have a separate bespoke, we try and have some standardisation, therefore helping the market to invest in and support it, rather than this constant reinvention of the wheel, which is often the case.
So good news is that we've, on Crossrail, we've gone and invested on a tunnelling academy that is then going to, in the UK, actually it's not that far away from the Stratford site. You can go and see there how tunnelling's go, and that then is going to be made available to the rest of the industry, so the next project that's got tunnelling can use that as well. You've had a go, Stephen. I think I was going to have a go here. I think we've done. Okay, he wants to come back.
Just say thank you very much. And one final comment, if I may. Being right at the very bottom of the food chain and being a specialist subcontractor and a specialist supplier, it is possible, and I have been able to change people's minds. So even though the architect, I understand, it is important to bring everybody together at the design stage and to provide integrated solutions. Even if you are a variation, and even if you are coming in at quite a late stage, people will still listen to you, and you can still make things happen. Thank you.
There's one here. That's right. There we are. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin Harris from Arup. London has a very rich cultural diversity. What lessons and influence did this rich mix have on the Olympic Park? And how could we use the learning to engage with the seat of such diversity around the world?
98% of it was done locally.
Well, 98% of it was done by British companies.
British companies, sorry.
50% of which were from London and the South East. I think the only thing I would say about the diversity issue is that, again, there was a target. So we said, we are determined to reflect the diversity of the area certainly in the employment opportunities that we're creating. We want to have at least 15% local people involved. We actually achieved 20 to 25% consistently from the 4 boroughs, and as Howard mentioned in his presentation, 16% from the different minority ethnic groups. The whole issue of accessibility was addressed very, very deliberately. Every architect design team spent whole days with all the disability groups saying, how are we going to make this better and work for you in terms of disability and accessibility in the future. I think you have to sort of say right up front, we want to take this on board. Now let's talk to those representing those different communities and agree with them how we're going to bring them in, against, however, the time frame. So it is, we're going to be able to devote 3 days to sitting down with you. We're not going to be able to devote 3 weeks. So send your best people, get your best ideas in, and we'll do the very best to take them on board. But if we get it slightly wrong, I'm sorry, there isn't going to be a second dip at this. And I think that's the challenge. It comes back to this issue of, which John mentioned earlier on, of how do you consult but actually get maximum value from the consultation to take these issues on board. Elephant and Castle, we've had that challenge over and over again.
Yeah, real quick, just because it's to a large degree British companies, please keep in mind, we are very international in the way we have our workforce structured. So I think I mentioned before in my short contribution just 25 nations within Atkins that contributed, but also from an organization perspective, more and more we get used as an industry to draw on the design centers across the planet to chime in with regard to a 24/7 kind of design activities to meet ambitious time schedules. So hence, for example, in our case, the GDC in Bangalore has been heavily involved into what we were doing. So there's intrinsically a high diversity that comes into action in large-scale projects like that.
I think that's absolutely right. That's what I was saying earlier on about the globalization of our industry. Right. It is certainly happening in the design phase of it all. We managed to do that seamlessly, actually, across the world. And I think it will come, as evidenced by the companies that are here. I think it will come through in construction, the actual construction process as well. There was a question here, I think.
Murray Rowden from Turner and Townsend. Maybe just an observation on the question about cost. I think my observation is, and we've probably touched on it, is that low levels of integration cost you lots of money. Absolutely. Higher levels of integration save you lots of money. So just an observation on that. Really picking up, Terry, your point about where's the opportunity in this. We've talked a lot about greenfield sites. So we talked about had a negative legacy to turn into a positive legacy. Is there any lessons learnt here from more greenfield applications, really thinking about developing countries, and about how the lessons learnt from, I guess, some coming from Glasgow, some of the mistakes were made that led to quite a negative legacy, how they can be avoided for more developing countries on a more greenfield environment?
If I may, I mean, the most spectacular greenfield approaches where I think our industry are asked to contribute at the moment typically happen in China, where you have enormous master planning opportunities in new cities that are surfacing out of nowhere. And I think what we are trying to apply there is what we all call the holistic approach to development, so that you really start to think through and that you have experts on the ground, not only in the technical disciplines of architecture, design, engineering, water, wastewater, energy supply, and what have you, but that you start also to involve social sciences in making sure that what we just saw with regard to Elephant and Castle, that you design from a deep understanding of the social and cultural setting that you are getting into as an engineer, that you start to design really squares and places, meeting points, the opportunity for rich cultural life, and exactly geared towards the communities that you design and engineered for. So it's a much more comprehensive approach to design and engineering and architecture, and then construction, how you put it in place. Also making sure that the surrounding communities, as we learned here from the Olympic exercise, that you constantly are engaged in communicating in what you are doing, and that people get involved, have a say, without losing sight of the fact that at the end of the day there's a delivery point when you have to get done with it. So that's I think the approach we see, and where in a greenfield setting you clearly have the benefit of putting it all together in an almost ideal way.
So again, it's an interesting question about the things. The thing that we're talking about today is regeneration. That's what we've been talking about. Of course, greenfield. I actually started my working life working for new town development corporations. These were totally new settlements that were built in greenfield, leaving the dereliction behind in the Manchesters, Londons, or wherever that was, and that. Perhaps is, the question I was going to ask is, what is the on-cost of regeneration? And I was just wondering, either as the Elephant and Castle or on the Olympic site, have we got an idea of how much extra that cost, and can we mitigate that? Because I don't think we can avoid it, but can we mitigate that in the lessons that we've learned? Because regeneration is going to be needed in all these cities that we're talking about around the world.
Well, I would argue that to a very large degree, Stratford was a greenfield site. It was a pretty contaminated greenfield site, but if you take the cost of dealing with that, it was a pretty small proportion in the whole. The larger infrastructure you would put into a greenfield site as much as we put it into the roads, bridges, sewage systems, and so on. That's all part of a greenfield development, as much as it has been in Stratford. I think the future is, and clearly the political pressure is going to be brownfield site development, and that's likely to be the case, I think, everywhere. So it's how do we optimize brownfield rather than dive into greenfield. And to me, it seems that the challenge, to a very large extent, is that big is not good. In a sense, we actually like to understand the boundaries of where we live, and we always talk about London as being a series of villages, and the key is connecting those villages. And I think even for a new complex, a totally new one, it must be the same challenge. And how do you create a series of small islands where people are living, where they've got their own community, they've got their own square, they've got their own shops around the corner? But then those individual communities are interconnected by very good and efficient transport systems, which enable you to move from one to the other.
But I think I've got it right. That is going to be the overwhelming demand for infrastructure and growth across the world is going to be concentrating in cities, in inner cities, in Lagos. I was in Luanda not long ago, where there's huge redevelopment, but it's in the city going on as well as spreading. So I think, John, you want to?
Yes, I was going to talk about value and identity. The elephant's in the middle of London. People sort of know it's there, but people are blind to it. They don't see the value of it, which is remarkable. It's been sat there derelict, or semi-derelict, or in need of regeneration for 20 years. And it's taken all that time before someone says, actually, this has a value. People have a value. They deserve better. Now, the local authority have been working very hard under two administrations now. It started with the Labour administration, went into Liberal Democrat and Conservative coalition, and now back to Labour, all of which have been talking about it. But now that it's actually structured into a position where it's going to happen, because the economics of it are still not great, but the vision is there. People have seen that it should happen and see what a wonderful opportunity it is. So the value is in raising its profile and giving it a setting within London that demonstrates to people it has a value, economic value as well as social. Great, just in time.
A question over here. Hope you can rise above the music.
I'll try to. Thank you very much, Terry. Martin Harmon, Pinsent Masons. I just wanted to ask John and Howard in particular about the success of what I term the procurement strategy. Being a lawyer, I work quite a lot in overseas countries. And I think when we talk about cost, the gentleman of the African Development Bank talking about reducing cost, it's a question of reducing across, but also increasing value. And I think the lesson I see, and I'd like to get the panel's reaction to that, is the collaborative contracting that went on in the Olympic Park, the sharing of risk rather than the allocation of risk to the private sector. So many governments that I tend to deal with feel that the best contract is the one that excludes them from all risk and passes all risk on to the contractor, and then has a dispute resolution machinery which makes the lawyers incredibly wealthy and has a very long period before the dispute is heard, which creates a poison in the contract and also adds to the cost. If one looks at a far more partnering approach, using forms of contract which have a risk sharing, have as you said, an incentive, Howard, as well, rather than all stick and no carrot. And it seems to me that that's one perhaps of the lessons which we should be looking to try and encourage other countries to embrace. But it does require, again, the comment which has been made, leadership from the public sector to agree to adopt a position which does see them taking their share of the risk.
Well, I think you're right. Our intention was to, with respect to use the legal profession at the beginning rather than to sort out the problems at the end. And I think the key to that was taking advice from a lot of people back to the listening issue. And we didn't have the time for a lot of argument, but we weren't going to be just fluffy either. It was public money and it had to be spent effectively. So we chose a form of contract that met our needs, and that was the new engineering form of contract, which demands as an obligation an integrated and collaborative approach. And the one very good thing about it for me is that it demands that the contractors provide information at the earliest date about bad news. Because the one thing in big operations particularly is bad news travels upwards very, very slowly. And if you're moving very fast, you can't afford that. So the form of contract we chose actually helped us. And is that exportable? Well, I was in Hong Kong last week talking to people in Hong Kong government who are looking at this now very seriously, particularly on some of their major infrastructure, to move away from what is quite a litigious operation in Hong Kong in terms of construction to one where there's a greater level of collaboration and cooperation. And of course, the other point is arguments cost both sides a great deal of money and finish up often with lost reputations on both sides.
Even sort of a bit of a backlog here. Wait just a second.
The point earlier, we were talking about how do you get the client, or whether it happens to be a government, to be able to define outcomes better. I mean, that was something I worked on quite a lot in PFI, which led to being able to do that. And standardization. You know, you talked about standardization. Well, even today, we've not got a standard, size for a classroom, a hospital, a prison cell. You know, they're all minimum. So they're all different. and yet you couldn't get anybody to sort of say, well, they should be this size. You know, and it's just impossible. So therefore, that determines the cost structure as you move forward. What chances do you think, having worked obviously in the UK as well as internationally, of getting this standardization, a standard lift, a standard whatever, more accepted, and therefore that reflected into the cost structure, of infrastructure going forward? I mean, even today, there's not a standard lift for between an airport and a railway station and a shopping centre, all doing the same thing.
I mean, American construction has always been cited as being pretty cost-effective. And a lot of it comes out of a big, thick book. You can go in 100 hotels in America and you'll find the same handle on the door. And you'll find repetition in that sense, and it does undoubtedly lead to a cheaper cost. Here, with due respect, our architects love to find the latest Danish beautifully sculpted handle for the door, which is going to cost us 10 times the one from B&Q. Yeah. And these are choices, and those choices have to be made by the client. And what does the client put as his highest priority? Is he looking for design quality? Is he looking for 100-year life? Is he looking for 20 years life? Is he looking for lowest cost? And unless he's very clear in which of those he wants, then you're going to have problems. And to me, it's, first of all, you've got to say, why do I want this? What purpose is it serving? Then, what am I going to do to ensure I get what I want? And then how do I deliver it? And if you don't ask the why, the what, and the how, in that order, and it's the only person who can address it is the client. And for the infrequent client, the opportunity is for architects and consultants particularly to sit down with him and help him through that process of why, what, and how. But these are standardization. Is inevitably something which you pay an element of a price for if you really value the aesthetics of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and the client has to make that choice.
Yeah, and I think in education, you mentioned education. I've done a number of schools and university buildings, and you would have thought that the educational system, especially for the old academy system where there was a lot of repetition, PFI system, a lot of repetition, there were how many different education models to deal with, all of which were right for a different place, and yet at the end of the day they were all wrong because they all changed. So where's the repetition at that level as well as on the component level? What's the brief that we're giving architects and designers to do a job with if it's not standard in itself? So the components that then follow are equally not going to be standard. And the other issue with standardization sometimes is that you end up with a monopoly. Only certain people produce those standard products. So therefore, where's the competition? So where's the value when you go to compete? And it doesn't exist anymore, and you lose that. So it's a kind of twizzling around. And yes, Danish handles are great, but only for particular clients. So you've got to do horses for courses.
I'm going to ask one last question here in a minute, but I'm going to use my chairman's role to put unreasonable demands on the panel here. I'm going to ask them to think and tell us all here one lesson to take away for each of our overseas guests here, given that we've heard that every place is different, you can't just simply pastry cutter from there to the... What is the one thing that we've learnt to take away? But first of all, I think we'll just have one last question over here.
Hi there, David Mitchell, BT. We've had some great insight today into the benefits of the physical building and the environments that have been left, legacy of the games. I just wonder what the panel's view is on technology, because I know from BT we've left a lot of technology legacy, if you like, in the Olympic Park and also in other environments. And it's just a question around the importance of that technology in the social and economic regeneration of these areas and the role that it plays.
Okay, I think that's I mean, I would say, but it really is for John and Howard to say, I would have said the sort of the deconstructibility of quite a lot of it that's in there, which, I was saying before, most infrastructure I'm aware of lasts 100 years or so. Actually, I've never seen the amount of stuff that there is at the Olympics that is absolutely fit for purpose now. But anyway, so I'd really turn it over to you two, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, Terry. I think the other one is, again, coming back to Howard's point about leadership from the client. For example, on the technology side, we demanded a phthalate-free PVC. Now, when we came to order the wrap for the stadium, it was the roof of the stadium, it was too soon, they hadn't developed it. But the industry rose to that challenge, so that by the time we got to the later buildings, we actually had a brand new product in the market, a phthalate-free PVC. That was an example of, in a sense, saying, as Terry did earlier on, can we have something? Yes, we can. We said to the concrete supply industry, how are we going to get the cement content down? How are we going, and what started out as you can only use cement replacement or you can only use recycled aggregate in the foundations Well, the designers, the mix designers from the best contractors finished up giving us Fairface concrete with that sort of recycled aggregate, and it's so those sort of technical, not really advances, but really they're there, hovering in the background half the time, and I think it's up to people to be demanding and to say, come on, let's get it. It's rather like, I suppose, how the people in the telecoms and the mobile phone industry are constantly thinking about what would make life easier for the user of the mobile phone. And I've got to be first into the market with that thing. I only discovered last night that I could stand at the bus stop and actually use my mobile phone to discover when the next 88 bus is coming along. I did it, it took me about 30 seconds to do it. It told me it was in 2 minutes, so I kept my 10 quid in my pocket and didn't take a taxi, because I knew that the 88 bus was going to be there in 2 minutes. Those sort of things where technology is enabling us to, and it's this push-pull. To what extent do we demand it, or to what extent can we lead and provide it? And you know, that's my response to Terry.
A colleague of mine said that everything inconvenient will change. Just think about that. Everything inconvenient will change. So, a takeaway. Who wants to come up? We've got one there ready.
Yeah, well, I've got one ready.
Okay, you last then. Come on.
Well, for me, it's about designing for the scale of the individual, the person. Yeah. So the human body is the thing that we're all designing for. Use it as a benchmark and a scale thing, which you walk around a city with and check whether it works. Yeah, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, great. Howard.
I'll go. I'm from a construction background, so as you'll gather, my job is to get stuff done, and I used to always think that the 3 R's were very important: ruthless, remorseless, and relentless in seeking your objective. And they do have their place. However,
this is a partnering client.
However, in an environment in which we were all working, I very quickly came to the conclusion, with some help, that one needed the 3 L's, which was leading, listening, and liaising. And I can leave no better with you than the 3 L's for success.
Difficult to top that, but we'll concentrate on one of these 3 L's, and that's the leadership part. In such an enormously complex project, I think the important lessons learned for us as engineers was, once you have the privilege to have the right leadership at the beginning of the project, thinking through all the utilization criteria that have to be met during the Olympics and then afterwards, it's actually possible that the whole supply chain steps up to the challenge and we produced collectively something stunning as what we can see today.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, I think having spent half my life as a contractor and half as a client, it's about governance. And what you have to do at the beginning is sort out your governance. So it's the responsibility of the client to understand how he's going to put in place a proper governance structure. Because if he doesn't do that, then chaos will result sooner or later down the line. And so the absolute responsibility on clients to sort out their governance and then provide leadership. And if they fail to do that, then they won't get a good product.
Fantastic. Well, can I thank you all? Can I say you've all been actually very, very good, because I haven't noticed any of you that much looking down at your BlackBerries and iPhone. But can anybody tell me, have we got any more goals yet this morning? Because getting towards the middle of the day, I don't know where we are. I heard it said the other day the streets of London are being paved with gold. So I think that's wonderful. Could I say I'm very proud that Arup has sponsored this day today to bring us all together. I think we've had a great discussion. Hope there's as valuable and stimulating ones happening in the other rooms as well. We're getting towards lunchtime. I just hope that you all are in absolutely no doubt that whilst we're all celebrating the sporting achievements that's going on at the moment, that you can all take away that the UK has got the skills, capabilities, the experience to be able to replicate the types of regeneration and construction that's going on back in your countries and around the world. So can I ask you all to thank the panelists for their contributions?